My name is Gabriela Rendon, and I'm really happy to have you all here. I'm the founder and director of the Parsus Housing Justice Lab. That is a platform for dialogue, research, and strategic design that advocates for equitable neighborhood development. And we bring always students, faculty, scholars, activists, and all of those that are working together for housing justice, and the right to housing. And we try to combine popular and academic knowledge. We do different type of projects. We organize public dialogues like this one here at the New School, but also in some communities. And yeah, what we are trying to do with through all these public programs is to amplify the efforts of communities, housing coalitions, urban movements, and policy platforms promoting housing justice. And at the same time, I'm wearing like different caps. I'm also the director of the MS Design and Urban Ecologies program, which is a program that radically reframes the story of urbanization and cities through design-led, just-in-center approaches. And this is a program that we start about 15 years ago, and I'm very happy to see here some alumni, that some people that I haven't seen in a while, and also our current students, and many of you that are new, like in this space. I welcome you all. This type of events is are events that we really care about, and well, I have the pleasure to do this with Karen Kubi, who is going to talk to you about why are we here, but this is just like a very warm welcome to you all. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you all for being here today. And a couple more thank yous. We're very happy to be hosted by the New School and to partner with the Parsons Housing Justice Lab and Parsons School of Design and the MS Design and Urban Ecologies major. So welcome to Architecture and the Right to Housing in New York. Housing is a human right. The right to housing is not just a slogan. Adequate housing was recognized in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN defines the right to housing through 7 elements: security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. But it's not just an economic and legal and political issue. Of course, it's all of these things. The argument behind the program tonight and a series I'm going to be talking about is that the right to housing is also architectural. We believe that the only way to fully address the right to housing is to look at it in an architectural way, and this will allow us to meet the human needs of residents and to respond to what is, like I said, not only a political failure, but a failure of imagination. We also see this as an issue of spatial justice, a term coined by Ed Soja that basically talks about how social justice is manifest in the built environment. So why are we here? We're here to address 2 sort of simple and sort of extremely complicated questions. What does the right to housing mean in practice, and how can architects and other urban professionals contribute? And who am I? You may know me from my work in New York. I was here for 20 years and still am here a lot, but I'm now at the University of Toronto, where I direct a new lab called not to be confused with this lab, the Architecture and Housing Justice Lab. And I also have the pleasure of convening the AIA's Right to Housing Working Group. The work you're seeing today, or the discussion today, is an extension of research from a book I put together, Housing as Intervention. So today's program is part of a series. We started in Mexico with a small roundtable that became a pilot for the larger series. Mexico has had the right to housing for over 100 years, since 1917, but really critical issues, especially with the fact that 70% of housing is auto-constructed. So what is the role of architecture? Then in Toronto, we had an amazing event bringing together a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing with an architect of social housing. And it's an exciting time in Canada because Canada got the right to housing in 2019. So this is a moment where we're really figuring out what it means and what it can mean. We're just coming back this summer, or North American summer. We were down in Argentina, which, as you know, is going through very difficult political issues that are affecting how housing works, and thinking about how to extend different ideas around cooperatives, et cetera, and the design ideas that have come through previous experiments. And then we were in Sao Paulo in Brazil. There's a few really exciting things. One is that because of the scholarships that existed under Lula's first term, there is now a generation of architects who grew up in favelas and are doing work in that context. So we were honored to have some of them there. You see pictured Carmen Silva, who's with the Downtown Homelessness Movement, or MSTC. So these have been amazing conversations, and now we arrive in our 5th of 6 cities across the Americas. Tell your friends in LA to come to our 6th and final event on October 20th at UCLA. And I should pause. I said a thank you, but I just want to say I'm massively honored and so grateful to work with Gabriela and Miguel. I knew their names. I knew about their really important work. And then we got to meet in Philadelphia instead of New York somehow. And we said we should work together. And then, it takes some time, but it's such a blessing. Thank you so much for your collaboration. So what we're arguing basically is that we need to share lessons across the Americas on these issues. We're arguing that the right to housing is spatial. We're arguing that housing advocates and architects must come together, and we're glad you're here. And so there will be, in each city, there's a public lecture like the one you're enjoying tonight. There's also a private convening. So highlights from those private conversations will be published in a phenomenal journal, Untapped. The editor, Tiffany, is here today. We're super honored to collaborate with them. They're a brilliant design journal that looks back to look forward. Their stories identify the most important knowledge about improving the built environment and contextualize it for today and tomorrow. So please look out for that. We're also collecting, you can find information about our previous programs. There will be information about this one coming up on our website, Architecture and Housing Justice Lab, architectureandhousingjustice.org. So tomorrow we will continue what we're doing today with a closed door session, a very small group of people bringing together architects, people working in policy, people with lived experience, etc. It's a very small table. If you're not there, I hope we'll still be friends. I'm so excited. So a big part of this project is to bring together people doing really important work on housing who aren't yet talking but should be, to be able to collaborate and make more impacts toward the right to housing. So I will turn it to Gabriela for official introductions for our 2 speakers tonight. But I'll just say, so Sam Stein and Deborah Gans have never ever shared a stage before. They haven't even met before, I don't think. But as you know, because you're here, these are really critical thinkers and doers in housing New York. So it's a great pleasure to have them together today. Gabriela, I'll turn to you to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much. Well, before introducing Sam and Deborah, Miguel Robles Duran, who is an associate professor of urbanism here at the New School, is going to give us a brief introduction on some of the issues that New York City is facing, housing issues. In each city, we address those issues. So, Miguel, if you can briefly, share with you your thoughts, please.
Thank you, everyone. I was asked to do these, and obviously I've been reflecting a lot of the current housing situation in relationship to this neo-fascist turn that we are all, I guess, suffering. Yeah, it's working. And part of this work, or part of this introduction, which is just 5 minutes, it's not work or any of that, it has to do with the work that we've been doing at the New School for, well, since Gabriela actually mentioned 15 years ago. We dreamt of a program that would be addressing housing justice, but also all kinds of urban justice issues. Very influenced by our colleague that also has taught here in several occasions, David Harvey. And we saw that there was a gap in the academic space, whereas most of the programs had a very strong technical component or very strong kind of classical training component. There were no programs that we knew about where they brought transdisciplinary perspectives. Most importantly, of course, housing justice or an urban justice lens towards everything we do. And so this intro is a little bit on this line. And I first want you to just stand at any corner in Bushwick at 6 a.m. and watch the construction workers board the L train. They are heading to build luxury towers in Manhattan, of course, and we know that they'll never afford them. Also, while you're rolling in there, if you're at 6 a.m., I don't think you're gonna see a lot of rolling suitcases. And there have been fewer now since September 2023, when the Airbnb was kinda stopped. But I can assure you there's still a lot of extraction happening from that side. And you can see also a lot of boarded up buildings all over the city. And in this specific scenario where I mentioned like 6 a.m. in Bushwick in one day, we're talking that Blackstone most certainly had bought it for cash, and it most certainly has outbidded 30 other families for that property. They're not renovating it, they're waiting. Blackstone is waiting. Empty buildings, according to the new finance laws, they appreciate faster than occupied ones. And this has been a major preoccupation of mine, as the majority of the discourse has been that more supply means that it's going to fix the housing crisis. I adamantly believe that's not the case. And it's kind of absurd to think that is the case today. This is New York, of course, where housing has perfected its transformation from shelter into a financial instrument, and New York has actually been one of the testing grounds for this. Where we know that our roof becomes a quarterly dividend, where the economics of our impossibility generates their prosperity, and I mean, of course, the owners of the means of production, that capitalist class. And I want to just to briefly introduction, just to walk through me how what I see is this machinery operates today in New York City, but also taking into account that it operates worldwide in a very similar way. This is not a New York City problem, and this is one of the first things I believe that we have to address. So I more or less play with four ways of 4 parts of a machine that goes step by step into doing all of this. And the first step, or the first mechanism, is a direct institutional capture. What I mean by this is that Blackstone executed 3 major New York City residential acquisitions totaling over $6 billion between 2015 and 2024. The flagship of these projects, as many of you might know, is Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, which they bought for $5.3 billion. And contains 11,200 apartments across 80 acres of the east side of Manhattan. In September 2015, Blackstone and First State Capital acquired 997 units across 24 Manhattan buildings for $690 million. Most recently, in November 2024, well, I guess a year ago, a Soho retail portfolio for around $200 million was also taken. And this is starting to mean that our apartments, where we live, are going to increase in its, I guess, the owners are going to increase the possession of the places that we live, and these owners, specific institutional owners and the monopoly players in these things. So one thing to know is that your apartment, or my apartment, exists more substantially in financial instruments than in physical space. And this is a huge issue that we face right now, right? And specifically in the discussion we're going to have with architecture. Finance has its own architecture, but it's not physical per se. So the second sort of mechanism that I plan to also work with the dialogue we have later is the platform monopolies. Platform monopolies control access. It is extremely difficult to find housing in New York without Zillow, without StreetEasy, without apartments.com. And they don't own the buildings, but they control the access completely. Search behavior itself, algorithms, data exploitation, has been very much a part of this, and it's becoming increasingly more and more a part of this. So if you browse luxury apartments, but somehow you want to apply to budget properties, these algorithms classify you perhaps as an aspirational overstretcher, and these are actually technical terms, right? And then that means that for the algorithm, you will be likely to accept inflated rents for marginal upgrades. And what you see in these pages are precisely what the algorithms want to show you according to your behavior, right? So every click that you do, all of these algorithms determine your future housing access. While of course we surrender our data to be monetized through advertising, et cetera, et cetera. The third, I'm almost done here, the third mechanism is asset conversion through short-term rentals. New York in September 2023 eliminated 35,000 Airbnb listings, which it was deemed as a success. A lot of organizing happened before that was put in law. But from the approximately at that time 38,000 listings, at the moment we only have 3,000 legal registrations remaining. And there was a 92% reduction, which is really a lot, right? But here's what I mean by this mechanism, is that this victory, which we can deem as victory, exposes New York's situation rather than solving anything. I mean, recently there was an article in the New York Times and a Wall Street Journal about it, and it was very controversial because they said, okay, the houses increase in prices, but the Airbnb being here or not doesn't make a difference, right? But what I mean by what it exposed is that Manhattan's median rent exceeded at that time $4,000 monthly for the first time in a year. The rising of the rents were 8.1%. The vacancy rate remained unchanged. And those Airbnb units generated service trips that destroyed local businesses, dissolved community networks, created what mental health workers document as Airbnb anxiety disorder. Removing the platform didn't immediately lower the prices and didn't solve all these issues because the damage had metastasized and the communities were destroyed, workers were displaced, and businesses collapsed. For me, the victory clarified the problem that we face rather than resolving any form of contradiction. And this is something we really have to think about, that one action is never going to be enough in this case. And lastly, the fourth part of the mechanism is ownership obscurity. Now, try finding who actually owns a corporate building, which perhaps you live in one of those. The management company claims they just administer, right, the building. The lease leaves some kind of company in Delaware, right, some LLC. But the corporate records of your building might show that the entity is owned by a Luxembourg fund. And that fund is managed by institutional investors that span 3 continents. So when your ceiling collapses, you can reach no one with decision-making power. And this has been a thing that has been increasing. So this isn't an accident, but this is the actual design of how things are supposed to work. And if you make the mathematics of what exactly this means for us, it means that it's impossible to exist in this city. if Manhattan's median rent at the moment is $4,500 monthly as of February 2025, which is an all-time record, and the median household income is $75,000 to $81,000, and you pay $4,500 in rent, that leaves you with almost nothing to live, right? And that is a gross income in this calculation that I'm trying you to make without counting food, transportation, or anything else we need to actually survive. The New York City Comptroller calculated that households needed approximately, listen to this, $140,000 income to actually not be rent burden. I don't think many of us make that money, right? And that is not being rent burden, paying a little bit above the 30% income that is supposed to be, the standard for affordable housing. So New York City faces double that of what actually is needed in terms of, like, if you need 140,000, most New Yorkers earn 70,000. I mean, as an average, right? So, and over half of New York City renters, which is 52.1%, today are rent burden, and those are the ones that are counted on the statistics, which means that 1 out of 2 of you here are suffering every month to pay the rent. I certainly suffer a lot, right? And so the compounding function where housings appreciate 8% annually in New York City, and the wages just grow 3%, and it is like, if we're lucky, right, that our wages actually grow 3%. And the homes cluster around $1.2, $1.3 million, right, in average. That would mean that any young person or any working person would need around 31 years of savings to actually make, the down payment. By then, I guess you're already ready to retire, right, on that front. And so all of these things that I'm mentioning are the things that I'm sure are going to be discussed in this, meeting or lecture. But we feel that they're very, very important, and more specifically in the way, how the hell do we address this systemic kind of crisis, which again is not from New York. New York has very little to do with it, surprisingly, right? And so besides just talking all of these kind of critiques or bad numbers that I'm mentioning, I do hope that we get to talk about something hopeful as we discuss. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Karen, Gabriela.
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, it's going to be an interesting conversation today and also tomorrow, because I was an architect. I am always an architect, but I jump more to urban planning, and it's always kind of like this question that the need of all these disciplines now working together. So I think that it's going to be very interesting to see how to address this. And well, we're going to start with Sam Malstein, who is a researcher and writer on the politics of planning in New York City, with an emphasis on housing, real estate, labor, and gentrification. He's a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society of New York, and has previously worked for New York City housing and labor institutions, including Tenants and Neighbors and the Service Employees International Union Local 32BJ. Stein is the author of the book Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate, published by Bergson in 2019. Amazing book, you really should read it. And he has also contributed chapters to several book projects, including Zone Out, Race and City Planning in New York City, Immigrant Crossroads, Globalization, Incorporation and Placemaking in Queens, New York, and Transformative Planning, Radical Alternatives to Neoliberal Urbanism. His scholarly writing has been published also in journals, as the Urban Affairs Review, International Planning Studies, and Journal of Urban Affairs. And his essays have been published in The Guardian, The Village Voice, The Buffer, and many other magazines and journals. Stein holds a PhD in Geography from the CUNY Graduate Center and a Master's in Urban Planning from Hunter College. So Sam, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
What does it mean that we chant these words at nearly every single housing demonstration in a city where every night over 100,000 people sleep in homeless shelters, and in a country where almost 750,000 people are homeless? Is the right to housing backed by local, state, national, or international law? If so, how is it being so flagrantly flouted? If a right is something that you are actionably entitled to do, have, or be protected from, does the right to housing still exist absent the power to wield it? Can rights hold up without the state or other collective power to enact and enforce them? Is housing a natural right? If housing, like everything else we need to live in this world, including healthcare, food, air, water, and so on, is a human right, whose responsibility is it to provide and protect it, and therefore who exactly is letting us down? Does couching the right to housing as a human right add validity to our claim, or does it remind us of all the other supposedly universal rights our governments routinely deny to portions of the population? Can we summon a right through incantation? Can we conjure its existence through the moral force of our convictions? Does a right exist because it should? These questions rush through my mind every time I hear these words chanted, which is to say many times a month, sometimes more than once daily, depending on the cadence of our campaigns. The space between where we are and what we say seems vast. To bridge that gap, we organize. We organize for a higher degree of control over our housing, and we pulled together a program for advancing toward a right to housing. There are typically 4 components to that program, none of them unique to New York: rental assistance, rent regulation, social housing conversions, and social housing development. Together they form a sideways approach to the right to housing, delivering a de facto rather than de jure answer to the question of how to secure this right for all. For the sake of time, I'm going to set aside rental assistance and rent control, essential though they are, and focus instead on social housing. What is social housing? Tom Waters, the late Tom Waters, and Oksana Mironova argue that housing becomes more social when it is less commodified, more residential controlled, and, perhaps most complexly, promotes the greatest degree of social equality, by which they meant both vertically within a building and horizontally across a city. To this, Gianpaolo Baiocchi and Jacob Carlson add the criteria of greater decarbonization, arguing that in the context of already ruinous climate change, for housing to be social, it must also be sustainable. Although debates rage about particular classifications, in the New York context, I would argue that public housing, limited equity cooperatives, community land trusts, or CLTs, and mutual housing associations, or MHAs, can all be modes of delivering social housing. Other housing types may qualify as well, but I believe the strongest case can be made for these 4. For simplicity's sake, allow me to offer a quick definition of each. Public housing is rentals owned and operated by government entities. Limited equity cooperatives are buildings where residents own shares and cannot make much profit from their sale. Community land trusts are nonprofit and democratically governed institutions that own land and, rather than selling plots outright, offer long-term leases at below market rates. Mutual housing associations are a form of nonprofit ownership where the tenants make up a majority of the governing board. A small but significant portion of the city's social housing stock was created by remaking buildings' ownership and governance models rather than being purpose-built as social housing from the ground up. This social housing conversions model holds personal resonance for me because for the last 5 years I've lived in this type of housing. There are multiple means and outcomes of such conversions. The city could foreclose on failing landlords and operate the building as municipal public housing, as we have done. Or the city could transfer ownership to a CLT and an MHA, as we have also done. Or we can offer the building to the residents as a limited equity cooperative, which New York did far more than those other two options. Most of the social housing conversions under that kind of model will take place in areas of landlord distress and even abandonment. The map of such conversions already in place in New York largely corresponds to areas with deep disinvestment in the 1970s and 80s, including the South Bronx, Washington Heights, Harlem, Hell's Kitchen, the Lower East Side, Williamsburg, and Central Brooklyn. Several of these areas have since gone through rounds of gentrification, making the existence and retention of limited equity cooperatives, CLTs, and MHAs even more crucial. Alternatively, the city, state, or federal government could pass an Opportunity to Purchase Act, granting either or both the local government or the tenants the right of first refusal when a qualified building goes up for sale. The residents could then have the choice of social housing model and operator, ranging from self-ownership via limited equity cooperatives to public ownership to community control. Social housing conversions are politically and architecturally interesting, in part because they evince simultaneously radical and conservative elements. On the one hand, they're a radical reclamation of housing, particularly in situations of landlord neglect and abandonment. Tenants themselves have committed labor to keep their buildings going, even in the absence of any compensation and often while continuing to pay rent to an absentee corporate body. By taking over their own housing, they're also reclaiming their own labor power and asserting a stake in their homes and their city's future. This is a concrete step toward deepening the meaning of a right to home and enacting a right to the city. But there can also be a conservative aspect to these conversions. They often involve interior renovations to make apartments more livable, but they rarely result in visible architectural changes to the built environment beyond better brick maintenance or perhaps green roofs. Whereas purpose-built social housing often proclaims its values through its architecture, whether that be bold brutalism or ostentatiously green design, these conversions are not about building the city as we collectively wish to see it, so much as taking back the city as it's already been designed. Perhaps the best way to understand both the potential and limitations of tenant-led social housing conversions is by comparison to workers who take over their employees' businesses. There's a long international history of firm mismanagement, or in some cases union demands that push companies beyond the market logic, that lead bosses to exit the business and workers to take over production. For my generation, perhaps the most iconic example is the Argentinian workers' movement's factory takeovers in the wake of that country's 2001 financial crisis. After taking over the business, workers must still operate the shop and keep the plant running, but they can do so on terms that better conform to their own preferences. They cannot unilaterally exit the market system, which may result in some self-exploitation or even exploitation of others outside the cooperative structure. But they can assert their collective self-determination and make their own decisions. Similarly, tenants who take over their buildings must still think about costs, upkeep, labor, and self-governance. They cannot collectivize the world beyond their co-op, but they can, at least, come to their own verdicts on how to maintain their buildings, where to put their savings, and how to deal with problems as they inevitably arise. The process is messy and contentious, without a doubt, but it's also equally empowering. For this model to work, we need city and state governments willing to actually enforce the laws that constrain landlords' exploitation, namely, strong rent regulation and strict housing code enforcement, paired with policies like the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act to transfer housing and financial commitments to acquisitions, renovations, operating subsidies, and rental assistance. Along with my colleagues Celeste Hornbach, Oksana Mironova, and Jacob Udell, we call this combined approach building pathways to social housing. These paths will by no means be smooth, but they nonetheless show how we might move from the deplorable present into a cooperative future. Conversions, however, make up only a small portion of New York's social housing stock. The vast majority of our social housing was built that way, and though some is privatized, most of it remains so today. Most of the social housing in New York City is public housing. With over 150,000 apartments and nearly 2,000 developments across the 5 boroughs, the New York City Public Housing Authority's program is the largest in the country. This is true not only in terms of units, which may not be surprising given that New York City is by far the largest municipality in the country, but also by percentage of the total housing stock. 90 years ago, the city made a commitment to public provision of affordable housing, and while 13% of the stock has since been brought under private management, New York has refused to follow most other American cities and either demolish or privatize most or all of its public housing. Unlike most other cities, New York got its start with public housing before the federal government took on and later abandoned this role. The first public housing in New York City was, in fact, municipal social housing. Originally planned as a conversion project, the city bought a stretch of Lower East Side tenements from the Astor family. When renovation plans turned too costly, the city instead tore the buildings down and built new, similarly proportioned and aligned buildings known as first houses. Soon thereafter, the New Deal initiated a particular model of public housing which emphasized so-called urban renewal and low-income housing production with a 1-to-1 unit ratio of public demolition to public development. While left-oriented New York City mayors like Fiorella LaGuardia and Congress and city council members like Vito Marcantonio and Ben Davis all wished for a better model, with public housing able to outbuild private housing and with a larger share of the city housed under its auspices, instead, the federalized system guided cities toward a tear-down and build-up model. This created a flood of internally displaced residents at a pace which constantly overwhelmed the city's resettlement authority. But it also built up an enduring bulkhead of working-class communities spread across 4/5 of the city's community districts, and forming as much as a third of the rental housing stock in a neighborhood like East Harlem. Alongside public housing stand other models of purpose-built social housing in New York, some of which preceded even the development of first houses. New York's original social housing developments were limited equity co-op projects, sponsored by working-class institutions in the Central Bronx, the Lower East Side, and Sunset Park. This model coalesced into the union cooperative movement led by the garment workers and their United Housing Federation, and joined by electrical workers, butchers, typesetters, furriers, and healthcare workers. Altogether, the model produced roughly 50,000 homes designed to be affordable for working class residents to buy, live in, and then pass on to other households in the same class position. Many of these projects turned into cooperative villages with not only shared open spaces and cultural facilities like theaters, libraries, and meeting rooms for residents to enjoy, but an entire solidarity economy ecosystem. Although none of these existed all together in the same projects, New York City cooperative developments collectively maintained cooperative pharmacies, health clinics, daycare facilities, nursery schools, school buses, groceries linked to politically aligned farms upstate, furniture stores, bakeries, kosher butcheries, sports clubs, energy purchasing, and later power generation schemes, and, at least in one case, its own community alternative to the municipal police. In addition to these union and worker-centric cooperatives were projects developed by other limited profit corporations with similar affordability guidelines. Under the state's Mitchell-Lama program, union developers, nonprofits, and other firms willing to limit their revenues could develop limited equity cooperatives and limited cost rentals with public support in the form of tax breaks, bond financing, and low interest loans. From the mid-1950s to the early 1980s, the program produced 69,000 cooperative apartments and 66,000 rentals. Looking back at her time growing up in a Mitchell-Lama cooperative, the author Jennifer Baum subtitled her memoir, growing up on the Upper West Side when housing was a human right. This is a bit of knowing hyperbole. Housing has never been treated as a human right in New York City, but this era of mass social housing production was perhaps the closest we've ever been, not only because social housing was plentiful, but because the very plenitude fostered a culture of care among those who enjoyed it. Crucially, however, the Mitchell-Lama program contained a so-called sunset clause, allowing owners to exit the program after its mortgage is paid. Subsequent laws have made it much harder to abandon affordability, but before this was done, more than half of the rentals and about 10% of the co-ops left the program. Some have gone into rent stabilization, while others rent or sell for as much as the market allows. Still, Mitchell-Lama housing and union cooperatives remain extremely popular models in New York City, which stands as evidence that New Yorkers might support a return to large-scale social housing construction. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers have put themselves on waiting lists for Mitchell-Lama, union cooperative, and public housing developments, each hoping that their number is called so that they can exit the antisocial housing landscape of profit-seeking landlords. Recently, New York housing activists, including homeless and tenant leaders, organizers, politicians, researchers, have been re-envisioning a new social housing model for New York State, which could build on the successes of the past while improving on their shortcomings. One result is a bill that would create a social housing development authority for New York State, a democratically operated public entity that could build new social housing as well as acquire buildings and oversee conversions. It's not perfect, and it remains far from passing, but it's the first time in a generation, if not longer, that the New York housing left has established and asserted its own positive vision for a new mode of housing production. And we're not alone in doing so. Around the country, city and state initiatives of various kinds have been experimenting with how to restart social housing production. From my birth state of Rhode Island, where Reclaim RI is fighting to transform the state's Department of Housing into a public developer with the power to build public housing and also to preserve existing buildings, to Seattle, Washington, where residents voted to create and fund a new municipal social housing developer. Sometimes I allow myself to daydream about what life in a city with a right to housing might be like. A New York City where everyone has a home they can afford, where we can stay as long as we wish and we can easily move whenever we choose, where we can live together in intergenerational families of birth or of choice, yet can still close a door and seek comfort in solitude, where crises still strike, but there are places to go for compassion and care, which will help us return to permanent housing as soon as we are able, where people can come together to deliberate and decide how we want our futures to unfold without fear that taking such action might either raise our rent or lower our property values, where communities can plan to combat climate change and protect ourselves against weather emergencies, including the possibility of moving to safer ground with new social housing there to welcome us, where the memory of mass homelessness, punishing rent burdens, poorer conditions, segregation, and gentrification are all distant, and where anyone who ran for mayor on a platform of raising rents for stabilized tenants and lowering taxes for real estate interests would be laughed off the debate stage. All of this is distressingly distant from the city, let alone the world we live in today, where we chant as our mantra that housing is a human right because we live in a city, state, and country where it is manifestly not. Hitting refresh on any given news site risks plunging myself deeper into anxiety bordering on panic, born not only from the fact that the world we inhabit is so far from the one we dream of, but that in many crucial ways that gap is worsening with every passing hour. It is a deeply dispiriting time to be doing much of anything, let alone aspiring toward a right to housing. It is hard to say that I'm holding out hope for our victory, but I am finding that hope is increasingly beside the point. I take to heart the words of Mike Davis, a consummate doomer but indefatigable fighter, who said, "Fight with hope, fight without hope, but fight absolutely." point is not to hope, but to act regardless. This lesson was driven home for me last year in a Hanukkah sermon by Abby Stein, an activist rabbi who recently helped lead my synagogue. As the Hanukkah story goes, a group of Jewish guerrillas lit a lamp with only enough oil to burn for one night, but somehow it burned for 8. The miracle in question had always been explained to me as God extending the life of the light for 7 extra days. True, Rabbi Stein argued, but emphasizing God's relatively mundane action here misses the point entirely. The real miracle, she taught, was not that God extended the lamp's life. The miracle was that the fighters lit it anyway, without any cause to believe that it would last. They had no foreknowledge or guarantees of what was to come, no sense of how their war-weary present might proceed into a peaceful future. In the story, God intervened not because they believed, but because in a moment of helplessness, they acted nonetheless. The lesson of the story for our day: the power exists entirely in the determination, not in the promise of deliverance. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. After listening to Miguel and, well, knowing like all the numbers, it's great that you are talking about like this building pathways to social housing that we will discuss more. So, but we will continue this conversation with Deborah Gans. Deborah, thank you for being here with us today. Deborah Gans is the founder and principal architect of Gans & Company, an architectural design firm based in Brooklyn, and a professor of architecture at the Pratt Institute, where she involves her students in real-world projects at the intersection of ecology, landscape, and housing. Educated in architecture at Princeton during a period of theoretical autonomy, Gans pivoted early on to pursue new forms of social engagement in design. Her work, particularly in housing, often serves as a platform for policy innovation and community revitalization. Her work spans architecture, industrial design, and community-based urban planning, often addressing extreme sites and social urgent programs. Notable projects include a HUD-funded community-based plan for post-Katrina recovery in New Orleans, and the East Side, developed in the Pratt Center. This initiative led to a multi-year engagement in Shepherd's Head Bay following a Superstorm Sandy, where Gans co-facilitated the resilient construction of housing and community infrastructure at the neighborhood scale. Current projects include limited equity co-op apartment structure has a land trust in Kingston, New York, with Garrison Architects. Gans is a fellow of American Institute of Architects and the recipient of numerous awards recognizing her contributions to architecture, education, and public advocacy. So, Deborah, please, if you can come
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll see. Just a little architect. I don't know what we can do, but you have to be optimistic to build something. Right, so we'll see. I just want to. Okay, cool. And you can hear me, right? Well, thank you so much for having me. So anyone who tries to build housing in New York of any kind knows that it's the cost of property that makes housing so difficult, or one thing that makes housing so difficult is the cost of property. So that fully affordable and deeply affordable housing depend usually on the gifting of the land to to the developer, supplemented by a truly limited toolbox of things like tax credit. I'll skip the acronyms and put them all up there. Tax credits, housing and community renewal funds that can be for rental or for ownership. And this affordability often comes with an expiration date, when the tax credits run out, or as Sam said, when the co-op, the affordability sunsets, which I guess doesn't happen in Mitchell-Lama that much, although there's still a lot of pressures from the people who live there, because with limited equity, the sales prices can be low enough the apartment shareholders can't afford to move, which is problematic, or because the city property values escalate so much, or the buildings can't afford to be repaired over time, right? Because there's not enough equity in the co-op to actually make repairs. So with those kinds of pressures to kind of sunset affordability and even a limited equity co-op, what is there to do? Well, Sam gave us another solution, which was a land trust, which is a kind of a limited equity co-op plus. And I'm going to talk about them today because I think there is some hope in them. And that is a map of them. They're becoming more and more appreciated and popular throughout the States and Europe, and those are the ones just in the city of New York. So how do we, so what is a land trust? And I'm sure some of you know, but just in case for those of you who don't, and I'm showing this funny picture of three old guys in the woods because originally in the United States, most of them were agricultural. And the United States actually had some of the earliest in the late 18th and early 19th century. But a land trust, and Sam explained it, trust members are actually their shareholders, not just stakeholders, who collectively own and manage land or have long-term leases, very long leases. They can be like 200 years long. Their membership can be unlimited. I actually belong to one in London for £1, or they can be linked in a place and to a particular community, like the East New York Community Land Trust I'm going to talk about tonight. Trust members who then are residents, meaning, or they either farm the land or they're residents in a building built upon the land, are called leaseholders, and they, in a sense, pay rent or own shares, just like in a limited equity co-op, contributing additional equity to the trust at large. So I only pay £1 to be part of this land trust, but if I had an apartment in one of them, I would have shares and be contributing more equity. As in a limited equity co-op, when you sell, you return your shares to the trust when you leave. But because the trust has a membership and a governance that is inclusive of but extends beyond the building residents, it's more stable and resistant to market pressures. Financial structures also add to that stability. The trust can keep some equity or ownership shares in all its apartments, so it can sell you 90% of the shares in an apartment. It can own multiple properties, each with resident leaseholders, so that all its eggs aren't in one basket, and then it has equity from those other properties. So as I said, both these are tactics to create assets and equity to use for maintenance, financing, debt, etc. So it keeps it more stable. And if a land trust has a network of properties, so it owns lots of properties and lots of buildings, it can give its members places to move within its own kind of trust ecology, right? So you can move from one apartment to another without leaving this kind of land trust network, and there's no need to sell your shares and markets, right? So there's a lot of potential there. And as I said, like there's an interborough land trust in New York City that has that kind of mission to connect kind of remotely placed properties within a single trust. And then there's other, like the East New York land trusts that are deeply rooted in a place in a community, but can have many properties. And then finally, there are trusts for public land, whose, and those guys I think are actually standing on a trust for public land, whose mission is simply to preserve land for the public good. And I really like that last definition, a structure of land stewardship that ensures it is used for public good. Because to me, it suggests many ways we can use the larger mission of a land trust to help us imagine yet more strategies of money and property that it can expand the ways we house. And we certainly need more of them. So I'm going to show you some land trusts. And this one is in Kingston, New York, as architects on a design build team with Garrison Architecture, Jesse McCormick, who teaches at City and knows a lot about land trusts, and the builder Maeda Construction. Actually, Nandini's in the audience, and she knows a lot about land trusts too. Anyway, so you have another expert in there. Anyway, and with Maeda Construction, we're going to complete a 15-unit limited equity co-op at 60% AMI for a variety of household types in Kingston, New York. Once it's built, it's going to be turned over to the Community Land Trust taproom, which will be the entity where the shares reside. This can happen because of a very forward-looking leadership in Ulster County in their planning department who are gifting the land and who want this to be a model, in fact, a replicable model, and they kind of liked us because we can design it as modular. We know a little bit about modular construction. And it will also be Passive House certified. So do not be deceived by its very conventional appearance, which is mandated by Kingston's really severe form-based code. It's really severe. And I will tell you, if you aren't used to working in traditional idioms, it is not easy to switch over and make a decent building. Anyway, it checks a lot of the boxes of what is required to make truly affordable housing in perpetuity in a place that is experiencing tremendous gentrification. Kingston's got a lot of gentrification. And it has a couple of the things that Sam was talking about. First of all, if you buy in at 60% AMI, you can stay no matter how your income grows, right? Which isn't true for rental programs. So this is trying to build equity while still having limited equity. And the way that works is you can be building equity personally, right? Because your rent or your shares and your maintenance are quite low, even if your ability to profit from the sale of your apartment is limited. And we're trying to find a formula that kind of builds that in, right? So there's a little bit of an inflation rate for the property built in, but when you sell your shares, but back to the co-op, but the real deal is that to live there from month to month, the mortgage rates and how we're subsidizing is so cheap that you can actually be building equity. While it's not developed by a community, it lays the foundation for one, and that it has a real range of units. It's got studios with kitchens facing a communal front porch designed for elderly residents. They're ADA, of course, 1, 2, 3 bedroom units and duplex maisonettes. There are the de rigueur community gardens, and 2 community rooms, one of which is a play space for children. So in this one, you see the de rigueur community gardens. You see what's in blue is this huge front porch was just supposed to be the community space, because I think those kind of, I think everybody wants that kind of stuff. But the thing that Sam described them as part of social housing, because somehow this notion of sharing, right, of things that are held in common, the idea of the commons is really somehow important to the operation of these buildings, these places. I mean, these are first-time homeowners, right? And they often bring life stresses with them. into such a building, and so the whole building has to be supportive. And I see Jonathan Kirschenfeld there, and he does supportive housing. He can tell you about that. So there's the from the porch looking out. And then here are all the different unit types on the 3rd floor, right? So you see it's got a great range. And also the other thing I would say, as an architect, you know, what you really want to make are good apartments. And they're hard to do, and they're hard to find. And part of the problem with the market rate housing is the apartments are terrible too. I mean, everybody suffers. Okay, so the only thing that is edgy about this project at all is this little land grab we did, meaning it's an easement across that red dotted line onto the school parking lot to make 15 spaces for our 15 households. So our parking lot is our commons. But even though, and school parking is next to it anyway, and it seems like nothing, but without this, the neighbors would have had objections as to an undue parking burden we're bringing to the neighborhood, and it would have really basically screwed, excuse my language, the potential for integrating our community into the larger one would have been a non-starter. So to build this building requires free land, the will of a county planning department, here come the acronyms, HCR, AHOP credits, NYC grants, and a really big not-for-profit foundation grant from a locally based NOVO, which is a big foundation up in Kingston. The trust isn't spearheading it or financing it. We are gifting, we are then giving it to the trust to be managed. So what happens when the first and maybe the only real asset you begin with is the community and their understanding of what they share and what is at stake? The Mews of Sheepshead Bay, that's how it's called, Sheepshead Bay, right? Were originally sunburn bungalows on landfill, owned across generations with some families owning several homes. This was an intimate condition, you can see. As property escalation made city housing increasingly unaffordable, owners winterized them and moved in year-round. And they increasingly found themselves in the same boat, so to speak, when the city installed new street sewers in the 70s, raising the perimeter streets and sinking the interior mews in a bathtub vulnerable to flooding. And you can see that there, that's just sunny day flooding sometime, and that's the steps to the street because the city raised the streets when they put in the sewers. But, as you see, the city did not provide a way for the sunken mews to get the rain and the garbage to the streets, so the residents needed to collectively install sump pumps that they share the cost of. Then Sandy hit and flooded the bathtubs and destroyed them all. We worked with them, first pro bono with Pratt Institute and then eventually my office, to create a community-based plan, and then with the city to rebuild the mews. And we discovered in doing this some new strategies and instruments that are land trust-like. Maybe they're land trust-like, I don't know. First of all, you couldn't just elevate one house without making flood impact on the house, on the next door worse, right? Because if you raise a house, then the flood comes in and hits the other house even harder. So the homeowners understood they had to work collectively. And they already shared the mews. Their property line, in red, ran down the center, as did the infrastructure below. So they already had a kind of land trust de facto in the form of an easement and the pumps that they maintained together. So it was not hard to build on the sense of co-ownership and help them envision a collective plan for resilient reconstruction that merged the building lots into one, eliminated their narrow side yards, and rebuilt the mews with row houses. This produced an additional several houses they could use to finance equity and a water management garden. And the idea was it was going to be a limited equity co-op, right? but one could have said it was gonna be a land trust. However, there's the money shot. They have these raised boardwalks that are collected, they have these water management, soft and infrastructure is all shared, had those bells and whistles. In the end, the rebuild required federal Build It Back monies, which some of you might remember from the city, right? They rebuilt New York after Sandy. However, the program was one single lot at a time, only within the property lines, because, it was made by the feds and it corresponded to the American suburban dream. Had nothing to do with cities. So since that was the only way the money was gonna come, we had to engage with the mayor's office, who was intrigued by our boardwalk, but would not leave the federal funds on the table. So in compromise, they rebuilt the homes as individual private properties in place, but then underwrote a shared and soft infrastructure, sewer, and sump pump. They then gifted what they built back to the Muse, which was collectively structured as a homeowner situation. Homeowners association. And you think of homeowners associations as being covenants that keep people out, but in fact, they're a kind of interesting tool that could be used in a different way. And then I guess I'm supposed to talk about the architecture. So there are the little houses, and you'll note that the fence is a lot lower than it used to be, and that's because now people could keep their dogs under the house inside the lattice, and we gave everybody these balconies so they could kind of talk across the Muse since they were now lifted above it. And there's people really like their porches, and then there's those little side yards that still existed, so we tried to make them like a reverse Hilltown since they're going up out of the pit. And then people do all these kinds of fun things under the houses. They have garden sheds, they have more shared porches, they have picnic tables. In Sheepshead, we worked with the courts individually, but also as a larger water management structure from Upland to Bay. We even reached out to the actual Trust for Public Land to see if they would purchase a strip along the bay as a new coastal wetland. Waterfront bungalow residents could then relocate to those upland Muse because we had some available houses. The entire plan hinted at the potent potential of linking housing, land trusts, and ecology in an era of climate change. So I really do think with climate change, it's a very powerful tool. And this becomes explicit in the next project. So this is a project underway with the fabulous East New York CLT in league with the great Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, and Meredith from that corporation is sitting right here. To make sure I don't say anything, they kickstarted a community-wide venture in the Jewel Streets. Look familiar? Again, low-lying, actually sunken below Conduit Ave, and flood-prone. I like the way he's delivering the mail. A mailman, nothing can get in the way to deliver mail. Also workforce and lower income, because who else lives in places like this? Also in need of public water infrastructure and housing in tandem. In fact, unbelievably, there are no sewers at all in the Jewel Streets. You might as well be like in rural Alabama. So here too, we have a naturally occurring community united by virtue of their environmental conditions and their lack of housing options. Indeed, the Jewel Streets cross the political property line between Brooklyn and Queens along Linden Boulevard, united by an aquifer and flow of water along Spring Creek, which you can see that empties ultimately into Jamaica Bay. The first efforts of the Jewel Street Coalition has been to claim a kind of collective authority, if not ownership, of the land that impacts their homes, basically the entire watershed. I helped, have been instrumental in convincing the city to employ a recently adopted Blue Way program, DEP has a new Blue Way program, to manage runoff and avoid raising the streets as they did in Sheepshead. Originally, they were gonna raise the streets like in Sheepshead. I don't know. Anyway, they won't do the daylighting of the stream shown here, but rather will create a pond and wetlands which limits the private easement and public land they need to purchase. They will need to buy just one property that way, north of Linden. But north of Linden, the single-family homes will remain as they are. But on the south side, the city's still proposing streets raised as much as 10 feet without offering to raise the houses, let alone the backyards. Rather, they are encouraging buyouts, basically per force. It will be the first city-managed pre-disaster climate retreat. The question is, how and where will they move? Will they scatter and their development network and their community network and all they share be lost? I mean, they've organized themselves finally. They have more of a connection than they've ever had. Will the city find them housing in the developer-driven implemented project that, oh, here comes HPD, Rob, I knew I'd say it, Housing Preservation Development, plans to build on the large site shown in pink, which happens to be already raised. What if, instead, the community stakeholders of this, actually now, yeah, there's just stakeholders, they're not shareholders yet. The community stakeholders of this New York CLT gift their homes to the CLT and thereby become resident leaseholders of the CLT. The CLT then sells their properties collectively to the city and with the proceeds builds new homes as a land trust. We actually discussed this morning. It might be too radical. Rather than individual climate migrants subject to market and city forces, the residents are then leaseholders in their shared equity and the most important, in their shared vision of their own resilient future. So, CODA. This is great. I love this place. It's outside London. This project, it's a CODA. It's an inspiration for the what if thought I just shared. First, because of its wonderful name, the Rural Urban Synthesis Society. How good and appropriate is that? It suggests the perfect transfer of the synthesis of agriculture and habitation of the first earliest land trusts to the current condition of ecology and habitation. And if you're an Anglophile the way I am, it channels William Morris and maybe hobbits. Besides its name, the Russ project at Church Grove inspires by the ways in which it came to be, through self-build, which Russ defines in its largest sense as designed with and by the community who lives in it and around it. Moreover, it was indeed actually built in part by them because they received their units partially or entirely unfinished, which allowed them to save money, but more importantly, so they could build their new lives together. So, thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. So, well, I invite you again, Sam and Deborah, and Karen and Miguel to come here to the table.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam and Deborah. Those are phenomenal talks, giving me a lot to think about. Before I introduce the first question, I thank the hosts and the partners, but we can't do this without funding. So I want to thank the Canadian government. We got a short grant to fund this, and the Irving Grossman Fund, and acknowledge that we talked about this being a series. This is the first time we're doing a program like this in a place where we do not have the right to housing in law, right? So, I think we can still, if we think about the slide showing accessibility, habitability, cultural adequacy, all these things, right? We can think about how architecture can contribute to those, even in the absence of the legal framework. I might start with a question for Sam. You said yes to an invitation to talk to a room that is maybe at least half architects and you also have written some amazing essays in the New York Review of Architecture, and you have some architectural ideas you put forward, right? Thinking about the difference between purpose-built social housing, helping to build the city we collectively wish to see, versus social housing conversions, which might be more intimate in scale in terms of what architecture is doing for residents. So I'm curious, what makes you want to keep talking to architects, and what do you hope for the architects in the audience if they take something away from your talk? What do you want them to remember?
They keep asking. I mean, architects are a great audience for urban planners, in part because urban planning can sometimes get stuck at either a very high level of abstraction or an extremely micro level of regulation and miss out on what we're actually talking about. And architects are sometimes good at connecting those gaps. You're also often extremely frustrated and angry and depressed, which I can relate to, and that's because you got into this because you have values and you want to build a certain kind of thing, you want to transform the world, and yet who's actually hiring you at any given time, and what are the constraints on it? And so, that's the same situation for people trained in planning. We get into planning because we don't actually want the market to decide everything. We want some sort of collective public process. Maybe we believe in state planning, maybe we don't, but then you go to work and you're either working for a city agency where the developers are paying the mayor to tell the city planning agency what to do, or maybe you work for the developers themselves, or you do what I do and you're an outside researcher, advocate, lobbyist person, and then are you really a planner anymore? So I think there's a lot between the architects and the planners. And if we housing policy people, tenant activists are gonna demand a new form of housing, we wanna work with the architects. And when I do community visioning sessions in neighborhoods to talk about social housing, people very quickly jump to design. Not only because seeing is believing, but also because they have very specific ideas about what they like about the kind of housing they have, what they don't like about it, what they like about the kind of housing they can't afford to live in but would want, what they hate about that form of housing. Everyone thinks like an architect already, so it's exciting to talk to people who actually do it.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, this is more like a comment, but yeah, also something to think about, because Miguel mentioned at the beginning this financial infrastructure, no? Like all the people is creating that we are not seeing, and that in a way many of us are fighting against that, no? Like those networks of financing and trying to find the ways. Everything is so abstract, no? And then Sam, you were talking about this social infrastructure that is needed for the transformation of all these buildings, no, that have the potential to be turned into social housing, no, that you call them, I think, conversions. So it's like a huge social infrastructure that needs to be organized and committed and informed, and to mobilize to identify the right buildings, or many times the tenants are part of these networks, so they know how to navigate some areas, not some others of bureaucracies and all that, but it is very important to create that social infrastructure in order to make these conversions, no? And on the other side, we have the physical infrastructures of Deborah, no, that are necessary, and it is interesting because with the building paths to social housing that you were mentioning is mostly like buildings that are inhabited, no? That people are suffering, that are under very poor conditions, and it's like, okay, this is enough, no? And then learning everything that Miguel told us, no? It is more upsetting, and it's a motive or a drive to be organized. And it is interesting to see the projects of Deborah. For some activists, that are, like I don't know if Tom is here, but when we all have this discussion with Tom and Gotti, it's always very important that for community land trust, the part of the community is key, But we see that in this project, there was not a community, and you are kind of facilitating like this space for a community to be built, yeah, so some activity will be like, oh no, that may not be right, but it's like, why not also? I think that it was a good provocation. I'm always kind of like on the other side, but thinking that if there is a need in that community, and as architects we have the capacity, or the power for connections or for funds, that is an interesting way. And even more the other examples that you mentioned, that you show us, that there are people living there that are experiencing, well, in this case, flooding, or maybe other issues like connected with climate change, to decide to do this, being homeowners, that is like a big thing, So it's just kind of like I don't know, like what do you think about this, So when you have like these conversations in case of like these communities, like if they are also being nurtured by things that are happening like in the city, I'm a fan of the New York community, East New York Community Land Trust, and the way that they have been organized. So I think that the pathways that we have available, but if you can talk a little bit more about those infrastructures and they're important, would be great.
Thank you so much, because I think I was at first uncomfortable in Kingston, because I'm so used to working on the ground in a place with a community. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I presented it like, oh, here's the traditional one, but in certain ways very untraditional, because it was a little top down and then gifted to a land trust, which is the weirdest thing ever, right? And yet I think it's fabulous that they're trying to do this, because we don't have enough tools, we don't have enough ways to do things. And actually, the one in London, the one I showed in Lewisham in London is really interesting, because the British government, not just London, but the British government is really interested in self-build land trusts right now, because they want to offload building affordable housing. And a little bit, I don't mean to be cynical. I'm the architect, I'm not supposed to be cynical. So, but they land trusts come to them with proposals, and they take them. And in that, and Kingston wanted to just build rental housing. We're the one who proposed doing a limited equity co-op and then having it managed by a land trust. And so I think it's a little weird, but we're also working, I guess the answer is, the way we parsed it, or the way we feel okay about it, is we're working with a local organization called RUPCO, and even I can't remember what that acronym means. And they are deeply embedded in the community, and they are gathering and finding and interviewing the potential residents. However, it is being designed without them. But we used RUPCO as our sounding board. We said, from what you know about 60% AMI in this community, does this seem right? And the only last thing I would say about it is, over time, if you're interested in social housing, you learn what Sam talked about. There are certain things that tend to be successful architectural tools, like the big porch, like a stoop, like a balcony, and you use them, and with a little experience, you
can be kind of successful, even if it hasn't gone through a long community design process. I hope. We'll see.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, it's really nice to see and to hear what you've been working on. I wanted to pose a question that is more related to praxis and to scale. I'm a person that has slowly moved into working macro scales and regional politics and national politics and macroeconomics and so forth. And the reason I ended up in this space was I felt that there was a gap, a huge gap, between what we're talking about, basically at the local scale, the architecture scale, to the urban planning scale, through it could be local politics, and then infrastructure works, economic policy, and urban policy at regional, local, right level, and so forth. And it always has felt that in the disciplines that we occupy, or that we do the praxis, there's always been a lack of, we don't, that when I studied architecture, I would say I did that. I was so amazed about how disconnected the discipline was from other disciplines. And equally, when I'm right now working with macroeconomists, they don't have a clue on how to actually land, right? Not that they have to, but one of the things that I've seen is that if we want to advance future-wise, that there is a need for restructuring practices and perhaps what we call disciplines or disciplinary apparatus. And I wonder that in your experience, right, what has that gap meant? Right? If you can tell us a little bit with what you know in relationship to the other things that are needed. Let's say if I would dream about a way of addressing this would be like a huge theme of all these transdisciplinary perspectives working in unison, right? Rather than just calling them when you're needed. Right? So I think who wants to start?
Yeah. So I can say like my own personal disciplinary pathway was a bunch of random stuff in college, and then I was a union worker, union organizer, researcher for a long time, and we were focused on improving economic conditions for our members, and we were really good at it in a city that was becoming increasingly hostile to them. So there was this contradiction of like, yeah, our contracts are getting better, but the rents are going up faster than the wages, even in these pretty good contracts. And a lot of the ways that we were advancing was by supporting projects that were undermining the working class networks of the city, because that's the sort of union growth apparatus. So then I switch over to urban planning so that I can understand this and maybe do something about it. And as soon as I get into urban planning, I basically figure out that you can't. That like you can change the rules about what private developers can do, but you can design a great public transit network, but unless you have the power and the money, it's all paper. And then what you actually do is manage the contradictions of capitalism at the urban scale, which is important, but it's not. So then I become a tenant organizer to address that problem. I work for a small nonprofit, and I think maybe working for a small nonprofit is going to be the scale issue to resolve the big union problem that I had before, where they're endorsing Michael Bloomberg in order to go along to get along and undermining their own program while they're advancing it. So I work for a small nonprofit doing tenant organizing, and we're so small that we have no power, and we are entirely dependent on the city council speaker to give us money to operate, so we can do nothing that alienates her at the time, Christine Quinn, thank you very much. And we are completely roadblocked by the insane politics of Albany, which have since gotten a lot better in a way, but this is around 2010 to 14, we're talking about the beginning of the Independent Democratic Conference, all sorts of ways to undermine any kind of progress. So then I quit that. I try to be a writer and an adjunct professor and try to figure out the ways that the world is working, and I only figure out that adjuncts are extremely exploited workers. So I get a PhD to do the same thing and get paid for it, graduate, can't get a job, am where I am now. So, but when I went to get a PhD, it was in geography, because geography is the discipline where there are no disciplines. It's just whatever you want. If it happens in space, then it's geography, which means that it's everything. So the advantage of that is you have people like David Harvey at the CUNY Graduate Center who are pursuing the totality. They're trying to live the Lukács dream of figuring the biggest picture out, which is incredible, but it's actually very hard to do that while having a grasp on anything that's actually going on in the real world, and David is remarkably good at doing that as well, but most people can only do one or the other. So you need all these people who have like a really good grasp on the hyper-local politics, but they don't really have a sense of why the hyper-local is the way that it is. And then you meet these people who have a great sense of the macro, but then they make assumptions about how things work, and they're actually completely wrong. So I'm not sure the totality exists in a way that a single human could actually grasp. And then once you take that in, what the hell do you do? So the answer is not to find a discipline, certainly. I mean, you're not going to find it in urban planning, you're not going to find it in architecture, but you kind of have to humble yourself to the fact that you're not going to find it at all.
Yeah, I go with that last statement. Is Herb Lehman still here? Maybe left. So he's the UDC. He started the UDC. Did he leave?
Yeah.
Yeah, he left. Yeah, because he's like, he'd answer your question. Because I think if I would say there's precedent for architects thinking with larger social perspectives. I mean, it was called the Utopian movement. They made a lot of mistakes. People blame Powers and Parks on them, which might not be quite fair. That's kind of like where I had you read my bio that I went to Princeton in the age of autonomy, because I think it's fairly new, honestly. It's a problem. But it hasn't always been this much of a problem. There have been periods throughout history where architects participated in the creation of institutions in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. We have a Beaux-Arts city, the public library, the public train station. Architects participated in that conversation, helped invent the thing that could facilitate and express those values. And the withdrawal from that was largely of our own making. And it created a kind of monstrous problem where it's now very difficult to recuperate that relationship to a developer. It's easier with not-for-profits and with the government, actually. You have to fight for something, but you can't always fight with people, right? In order to find the detente detente's a bad word, I guess, but the relationship that lets you move forward. But I think, the isolation wasn't always the case. But the big thing that we have is the need for interdisciplinarity because of the climate crisis, honestly. I always thought that was going to make a new international style. I'm so shocked it hasn't. Right? And that means style. But I thought it would kind of put people on the same page, and it hasn't. But maybe it still will make for that large scale, because again, those events are regional, if not global. They transcend boundaries that we set up in departments we set. Anyway, I don't know, just some thoughts.
We know there's very brilliant active people in the audience. Who has a question for our speakers from the audience?
Hi, thank you so much for doing this panel, doing these presentations. Very excited to be here. I wanted to sort of ask a question. I know we're focused on architecture tonight, but I was curious in the conversation around community land trusts and the architect's role of designing the buildings, but also being part of the community engagement. How much, I guess if you have examples, or what part of the equation, the actual labor that goes into building the buildings, maintaining them, is part of the conversation. Like in the way we heard about how many houses in Mexico are like auto-constructed. We heard about in Bushwick, where I live also, there's a ton of construction workers, you know, working as an architect. I'm on site and seeing the amount of labor and knowledge that goes into putting buildings together. And also as someone who's worked on NYCHA buildings, we see that their construction, their existence is important, but maintenance is also a huge thing that we're contending with. And so I'm just wondering how you see the actual labor of, I guess, labor and knowledge as an asset that can be used in both, I guess, like getting property, but actually building the buildings, actually being the people to maintain them, being the like on-site super kind of thing, as like, that's also a huge asset. You know, if you're thinking about,
Let's let her answer.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's good, that's good.
Oh, for me? I was thinking also that maybe we can pick up.
Oh,
other
two,
things.
good idea, yeah, let's do one more.
Just two more
Good idea.
questions and then we can,
Good idea.
because of the time.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you everyone. So my question is, strategically, how useful do you all find a rights-based framework in the fight for housing justice, given that there are a number of things that should be rights but aren't, or are, but those rights are not upheld? So what does a rights-based framework offer and what are its limitations? And are there other frameworks that are worth considering?
Thank you so much for being here. This has been fabulous. I am in Nandini's studio at Spitzer right now. We're looking at the Jewel Streets and the Stanley site in a very explicit way. I'm just curious about this idea of managed retreat as this buyout program is rolling out right now, or starting to be talked about more explicitly. It seems to be the most, one of the best tools in our toolbox to deal with this idea. How does the CLT truly fit into this question in an ecological context? Because I think you kind of threw it out there quickly, but it seems like sort of a kernel of really strong potential. So if you just said a little bit more, thank you.
Okay, so I'll try to roll the first and the last together. So that, you should take a look at the last one I showed, the Russ example. That is self-built in the, as to the degree that a 35-unit concrete frame building can be self-built, kind of like the plug-in Habraken model. And it was mentored out of a legacy of community self-built that goes back to Walter Siegel and the beginning, right after the Second World War. No, actually, before the Second World War, in that area of London. And there are whole communities of self-built houses. He created a self-built system, and it didn't, and taught people how to do it. And that's part of the mission of Russ. They also, that little community building is a school. And so it is very, much comes out of a kind of British legacy of these self-built muse. The one in Sheepshead was not self-built. But I think they'll be really interested in that. But the way it segues into the other question is that it was self-built means self-managed, self-designed. You don't actually have to have a hammer in your hand, although that can be part of it. It means this kind of total involvement in the process. And I think that is very true of the community that Cypress Hills and East New York CLT is building in the Jewel Streets. And I think that that is both the challenge and opportunity of climate retreat, and that you can divide and conquer and move people separately, which is what happened when the state did the buyout program after Sandy in Staten Island. They moved a whole community, but they moved them separately. And they bought out the houses separately. People actually couldn't afford to stay in New York because even though they got 110% what their house was worth, that didn't really help because in the floods and it wasn't worth a lot. It was a kind of dismembering of a community, and that is antithetical to what an organizing movement, when a CLT is an organizer, like that one is, it's antithetical to what their mission is. So I think that, I don't know what's gonna happen there, but I think especially in cases of climate retreat, where you're dealing with these large tracts of property ultimately, because you're not gonna just do climate retreat for one person, it's always gonna be collective. I think, again, it's a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity for us to think what that means. How do you move, and then how does a community move, and how is it more powerful in its relocation than when not? So that's not really a direct answer.
I can take on the rights question. From the introduction to my talk, you can tell that I'm skeptical of this idea a little bit. On the one hand, I have a real issue with declaring things rights because we want them to be rights. I think we do that a lot. We human beings, we the left, New Yorkers sometimes. And so in my own work, I haven't really referred much to the right to housing, to the right to the city. Like if it helps you realize what we don't have, that's great. But I always feel weird about the word is in the chant, housing is a human right. Because if it is a human right, but we have 100,000 homeless people in the city, then like, what the hell is going on? So those kinds of rights I don't find particularly useful, but there are people in this room who do, and do excellent things to inspire people to make it a real right. And so if it bridges the gap between the terrible existence we live in and the better world we dream of, good. On the other hand, I work entirely in the framework of tenants' rights that are real and that exist, and that if their landlord violates you, I can do something about that. And I'm trying to expand tenants' rights. I'm trying to expand rent stabilization, which is essentially a package of tenants' rights, to more tenants in New York City. I'm trying to expand rent stabilization to more places in New York State. All of this is just another rights-based framework. But at that point, a right is just another word for a thing you won and you want to keep. If you don't want to call it a right, don't call it a right, but that's what it is. It's like we won the ability to limit the amount that landlords can raise rents. We won the ability to have a guaranteed lease renewal. That's nothing to look down on just because I'm skeptical of the idea that something else is a right that I can't actually do anything about. Housing might be a human right according to the UN. There's an interpretation of the 1949 housing law that says it's a right here. 100,000 homeless people in that. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Any other
curious, this is more of like, I guess, a policy-oriented question, but I'm a social worker, and sometimes like a lot of my clients live in like community development corporation-owned housing, but yet they'll still, like if they're not paying their rent, they'll still receive eviction notices, which ends up being a problem because like community developing corporations going against its morals, but also they don't want people to end up with rent debt, and they also like want to pay the balances at the end of the month or whatever. I'm curious, where do you see tensions between like this like very great community-oriented, community land trust, like sort of very like social framework, and the tensions between that and like the very obviously market-driven New York City real estate landscape?
Yeah, so the landlord's right. The landlord's right to evict the tenant in that case, whether the landlord is a nonprofit community development corporation, whether it ground leases from a CLT, whether it's a for-profit individual owner, whether it's a limited liability corporation, the landlord has the right. So then the question is, I don't want the landlord to have that right, what am I gonna do about it? The entire community development corporation landscape is pretty diverse, from ones that really will do every single thing in their power not to evict somebody until they absolutely can't figure anything out anymore, to ones that will have a higher eviction rate than most corporate landlords. So it's hard to paint with a broad brush, but I think that's part of the mistake, is assuming that because they have the legal framework of a well, it's not a 501c3, but of a nonprofit entity, they will act in this sort of moral code. But they exist in capitalism the same as anybody else. They have debts that they're repaying. There are, as I keep saying, 100,000 homeless people who need housing, and they will bring somebody else in with a voucher. And so we shouldn't expect them, is what I'm saying, to operate differently. Part of the problem in New York City and America is that a large portion of our tenant organizing groups are actually spin-offs of community development corporations. Yeah. And if you work for one of those organizers, you can't organize in the buildings of your own CDC, and for most of them, you can't organize in anybody else's CDC either. So they exist in this organizer-free zone where they can get away with a lot of bad stuff. So if we're serious about this being a tenant movement and not a nonprofit spin-off project, we're gonna have to get over that.
Well, I think that we are going to close just to be mindful about the time, but I just want to mention that it was very, it is very interesting what you mentioned about like the connection with labor movements and housing movements, and the fact that, I mean, we didn't have the opportunity to talk much about this, but the rise of tenant unions and neighborhood unions, and this will be for another conversation that I will invite you to here at the New School. But yeah, I'm also thinking in the praxis, that architecture, planning, law, I think that we need to. I want you all to think about if tenants are organizing, like at the community level, at the borough level, and in the type of unions, what type of unions we can create, as a group of practitioners, talking about that transdisciplinarity that we were discussing, and yeah, using like really our knowledge, for that public good, and all those movements that are already like very active, So how to come together, like these two groups, but thinking about that transdisciplinarity to make it more tangible, because I think that we use a lot that word, but sometimes we don't practice it. We are like all in those divisions. So just something to think about, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. So next week we are going to have another event here in a very similar room that is organized by Rob Robinson, who is here, and also the Housing Justice Lab, with a large group, like a large coalition on housing rights, and we are going to talk about the criminalization of homelessness and how to enforce these human rights, no, like that are so important. So yeah, if you want to continue, this conversation, please join us. And thank you so much, Deborah, Sam, and Miguel, and Karen for being here with us tonight. So thank you all. There is some food outside.